Anthony Albanese continues to put our relationship with the US and, by extension, our national security at risk by staying pig-headed on defense spending. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt made it clear earlier today US President Donald Trump still had an expectation Australia would lift its game.
He's made the same demands of Asia-Pacific allies of the United States, including Australia, where I'm from. How does the NATO result impact negotiations with Asia-Pacific allies?
If our allies in Europe and our NATO allies can do it, I think our allies and our friends in the Asia-Pacific region can do it as well.
Now, we've seen what can happen if we don't come to the table. Trump this week threatened to double the tariffs on Spain after President Pedro Sanchez refused to lift his country's defense spending above 2.1%. Trump is accusing him of free riding off America.
So we'll make it up. You know what we're going to do? We're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal. We're going to make them pay twice as much. And I'm actually serious about that.
You reckon he's really going to let Australia off the hook for a measly lift in defence spending to just 2.3% of our GDP? It doesn't help that the Albanese government has been drifting further and further away from the US on foreign policy, specifically with its growing hostility towards Israel. Consider how it took Labor 24 hours to even voice what should have been immediate, unequivocal support for our closest ally when the Americans executed their strikes on Iran. Instead, the government was busy seeking advice on the legality of stopping the regime's nuclear ambitions. The fractures in our relationship with the US are now glaringly obvious. Read between the lines of this other exchange Caroline Leavitt had with an Australian reporter.
He missed out on a number of bilateral meetings that were scheduled with other world leaders, including the Prime Minister of Australia. Are there plans afoot to make up for those meetings with the world leaders that he missed out on?
Yeah, I think many of those world leaders understood the situation happening in the Middle East. He has made up a couple of those meetings, and he has had direct phone calls with some of those leaders he was supposed to meet with as well.
So he has made up some of those meetings, but not with us. Albanese clearly isn't considered important or friendly enough to prioritise a rescheduled meeting. In fact, Trump's people didn't even bother to let Australian officials know their meeting on the sidelines of the G7 was off. Yet they somehow found the time to give a heads up to other allies, like the Mexican leader. Now, Albanese today tried his best to make light of it all.
You can't get a meeting with Donald Trump. How would you expect to avoid the same fate as Spain?
There's a big focus on Spain at this area of East Hills here today. Look, we'll invest in whatever capability we need.
He thinks he comes off as strong, but this dismissal of our closest allies' requests is short-sighted. You only need to look at the incredible display of US military power we've seen in Iran to know how much we need America when, not if, the proverbial hits the fan. And speaking of military might, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's update late last night should silence critics of the operation who seized on a leaked preliminary report from the Defense Intelligence Authority, focus on preliminary here, to push the narrative that these strikes really hadn't been all that successful at all.
How about the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission? The devastating U.S. strikes on Fordow destroyed the site's critical infrastructure and rendered the enrichment facility inoperable. Have any of these quotes made their way into the New York Times or the Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN? Any of these quotes? How about this one? This is a new one from the UN, the United Nations. No friend of the United States, or certainly Israel often. Here's the head of the UN Atomic Energy Agency this morning, Rafael Grossi. U.S. and Israeli strikes caused enormous damage to Iran's nuclear sites.
Hegseth also spent time calling out the Trump derangement syndrome that still plagues so much of the mainstream media. here in Australia too. It's an affliction that's so all-encompassing, it needs to invent new ways to discredit the US president when he's just helped to conduct what could be the greatest peacemaking exercise of our time.
Because you, and I mean specifically you, the press, because you cheer against Trump so hard, it's like in your DNA and in your blood to cheer against Trump, because you want him not to be successful so bad, you have to cheer against the efficacy of these strikes.
Of course, I'm not suggesting that Donald Trump is above criticism. No leader is. And to be frank, there's plenty to call him out on. But this is a war between good and evil. An evil regime on the cusp of having nuclear bombs and the Western nations trying to stop it and save the rest of us.